don't say a word. If you're asked a question, don't answer the question. Just say you don't know and move on. And I was like, well, I don't work for you, but yes, sir. And so I'm in there and I'm flipping the slides, and General Gray, Al Gray, the commandant, says he's asking questions, and I'm flipping the slides, and finally looks over and he goes, I'm asking questions to these guys, but I think I'm asking questions to the wrong person. He said, I'm watching you. I think you're more than just a captain flipping slides. I think you wrote this plan. I think this is your plan. Am I right? And I looked at the colonel, the SEAL who was giving the briefing. He's like, yeah, yes, sir. He goes, okay, so I'm going to ask you, what do you think of the plans of success? And I said, basically, the Iraqis aren't 10 feet tall, that if we shock their command and control and we hit them with a mailed fist like this, I said, they'll chew hoi, which is a Vietnam word, hands up, surrender, run. And I said, my guess is that we will spend far more time processing Iraqi prisoners of war than we will killing Iraqis. Turned out to be 100% correct. I got yelled at by the colonel afterwards, but my point is the military is very conservative. They don't go in for wild ass, speculative things. You don't commit that many forces. I had done another plan to insert a reinforced LAV company to do a raid. And I remember one of the helicopter pilots that was advising Colonel Seifert, he flew a helicopter during the Desert One rescue mission. That didn't go well. And he stood up and he said, we shouldn't be doing this because we have, problem is, we don't get enough helicopters. We have Marines trapped, da, da, da. And when you have somebody of his stature raise a question like that, you can't go forward with the mission because, God forbid, we don't have enough helicopters and Marines die. The people that signed off on it are in a lot of trouble. If you can't respond by saying, no, we have sufficient helicopters to make up for the deficiency, we have a backup plan, all this stuff, it doesn't go down. So that mission got thrown out. And the reason why I bring this up is that there's no one right now saying we can't do that. We can't accomplish that, which tells you something, because these aren't amateurs. These are people who have studied the threat, who have very good intelligence, technical intelligence. I mean, we can sit here and go, oh, the Su-35, this, that, and the other thing. I could probably guarantee that the basic blueprints of the Su-35 are in the hands of the United States with all the performance characteristics, and that when we do the top secret simulations in Nevada, our pilots are going up against F-16s, et cetera, that have been programmed to accurately replicate the performance standards of these planes. So we're not going in based upon speculative chest thumping. We're going in because we have studied the problem, and there's a confidence that we can suppress the Iranian ballistic missiles. There's a confidence we can shut down their radars. There's a confidence we can suppress their air defense. There's a confidence we'll be able to strike the targets we want to strike. The generals aren't saying we can't do this. They're saying we don't have enough ammunition to do this. Two different arguments. And so I just think that, there's no guarantee. Just because we think we can do something doesn't mean we're going to be able to do it either. Because the Iranians are professionals as well. And they're preparing. They've been studying the United States for a long time. For all the Americans out there that poo-poo Iranian capability, Google the Beast of Kandahar, RQ-76 or 176. I don't know. Can't remember. The giant B-2 looking, stealth drone. And how the Iranians stole it. How did they steal it? By monitoring the Beast of Kandahar taking off from Kandahar, then doing the top secret handshake to transfer control of the aircraft from ground controllers in Kandahar to controllers operating via satellite link from Nevada. It's highly encrypted. There might be other mechanisms involved to secure. The Iranians monitored it and were able to break in and take control of the drone and land it and own it. Ask the Israelis about in 2006, the Iranian SIGINT units that broke into their they're frequency hopping tactical radios. Frequency hopping means you've got an encrypted signal, so it's already problems. But instead of just communicating on the one line, it's jumping around different frequencies, hopping back and forth. And if you don't know the key, all you hear is shh as it hops around because you can't lock in on the frequency in time. And if you can, it's usually done later when you've collected it, you run it through a supercomputer and you're able to, get it all in, but it's too late. The battle's over. The Iranians were able to assist Hezbollah by breaking into these comms real time. And then they had SIGINT operators who spoke Hebrew perfectly and were trained to mimic. And so they broke in and they were able to use Hebrew language, using code words and speaking in a way that mimicked the people. And they gave code words to initiate, phase alpha, Apple. And Sayed Matkal, the elite special forces of Israel, launched an attack straight into a Hezbollah ambush. That just doesn't happen, guys. It happens because the Iranians are pretty damn good at what they do, and that has to be respected as well. And the fact that I'm saying this means the U.S. military knows this, which means somewhere there's an analyst like Scott Ritter saying this is what the Iranians are capable of doing. And yet we still are confident enough to say, no, we got this. We just don't have enough bombs. And I bring this up because I don't think the press reports are saying what the generals are saying. The press reports are saying what the reporters want the generals to be saying. But I think what the generals are saying is we can kick Iran's ass. We just don't have enough bombs to keep kicking their ass. And when we run out of bombs, then Iran will be able to hurt us and drag us into a long fight. It's a sustainability issue, not a performance issue.
Isn't that the same in Ukraine? Because they, when they started the war in Ukraine, they thought that they're going to bring Russia down. They're going to do regime change in Russia. The same, Scott. It seems that everything is just repeating in my mind. And if you go,
Russian.
You remember what they were talking about the Russian army in those days? It's a defensive army. They don't have the battlefield, experience. They don't know what to do. But as time went by, we saw how the Russians are advancing and getting better and better. These are the nature of the wars.
They adapted.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainians got better and better too. Someday the true story of the first months of that war will be published. The Russian army, yes, I mean, again, a story from a former fighter of the Donbass militias who, was a veteran and went on to become a reporter. He told me about how when the SMO began, he, contacted all of his buddies, who from the militias saying, stand down, watch this. The adults are coming in. Watch what they do. And then he watched the Russian army come in. He went, they don't have any idea what they're doing. They're making huge mistakes. You can't, go into an urban environment the way they're going in. You can't, project power without flank security. You're going to get ambushed. And sure enough, ambushes, death, destruction. And he called the guys up and goes, we got to get back engaged. We got to start talking to the Russians about reality. The Russians performed not the greatest way. And a lot of people pick up on that and say, well, the Russians suck. The Russians destroyed the Ukrainian army. People tend to forget that point, that from the time they invaded until April, they had destroyed the bulk of the Ukrainian army. It was only when we injected $48 billion and there was emergency mobilization of territorial forces, et cetera. Remember, back then, they didn't have guys running around beating people on the head. They actually had trained reserves. And they brought these reserves in, organized them, got them equipment, and shoved them into the line. And you combine that with the fact that the Russians had agreed to confidence-building measures in accordance to the Istanbul Communique, which had the Russians withdrawing voluntarily from territories. And in the Kharkov region, the First Guards Tank Army, over 50% of it was already back on Russian soil refitting. So when the new Ukrainian army counterattacked, there wasn't anybody to block them, and they used tactics that broke through the gaps, got 20 kilometers deep, and forced the Russians to withdraw. But then the Russians mobilized 300,000 men. General Surovikin came in, created the Surovikin Line. General Romanov was sent to the General Staff Academy and rewrote the defensive manual, came back, built the defenses outside of Tokmak, the Robotyno, right where Zaluzhny said the main counterattack of 2023 was going to be, and the Russians crushed the counterattack. And since that time, the Russians have been adapting and moving on. But at no time did the Russians come in with anything like what we're ready to go into Iran with. The Russians didn't go in with a war-winning posture or strategy. I mean, we're talking, 90 to 100,000 troops going up against a Ukrainian force that outnumbered it 4-1. You don't do that. Unless they were trying to achieve the occupation of big cities. They didn't have enough troops. They were trying to compel the Ukrainian government to go into negotiations, which they succeeded in doing. 3 rounds of negotiations in Gomel, 2 additional rounds in Turkey, culminating in a nearly completed peace deal that Boris Johnson came in and scuttled. But that's what the Russians were doing. We can't sit there and say, do a comparative analysis saying, oh, we got it all wrong. Everybody got it wrong about the Russians because nobody understood what the Russians were up to. Even the Russians didn't understand what the Russians are up to, I think. I mean, I think some people knew what they were doing, but, it was just not enough troops. And then it took, the whole thing about Wagner, Wagner was a stopgap measure. Wagner wasn't supposed to exist. Wagner was created in May of 2022, after the decision was made that the Ukrainians weren't going to surrender. Now they have to take the Donbass, but they didn't have sufficient troops. So Wagner was created to assist the militias of the Donbass, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Army. The Russians are, reacting. Cobbling things together. It was very much a reactive battle plan. It wasn't a well thought out battle plan with plan A, plan B, plan C. Plan B was, damn it, we didn't get them to surrender or agree to peace terms. So now we have to fight. So we're going to take the Donbass and we're going to create Wagner to do it because we have a legal problem. We're not legally allowed to deploy the Russian army on the territories of Lugansk and Donetsk. But this is where the bulk of the fighting needs to take place. So you just can't make a direct comparison between what happened between Russia and Ukraine and what could happen between the United States and Iran. But, you are right. The Russian army has adapted. But even to this day, they're not fighting a war. I just want people to understand that. If they were fighting a war, there wouldn't have been a wreath-laying ceremony in Kiev where all of the European leaders got together at one point. Because if we're fighting a war, they'd all be dead. An Oreshnik missile would have hit that spot, 10 minutes after launch. Zelensky would be long dead, Budanov dead, Zaluzhny dead. But the Russians aren't killing the senior leadership. The Russians, how come people can still show up in Kiev rail station? Why is there a Kiev rail station? Because if this was a war, it wouldn't exist. Bankova wouldn't exist. The president's administration wouldn't exist. But it's not a war. It's a special military operation that's become more complex and more violent and operates on a more massive scale. But it's not a war. That's the last thing it is. It's warlike, but it's not a war. It's a special military operation. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in this conflict that makes it hard to explain sometimes what's really going on, because there's so much politics involved in this conflict.
But Ukraine is unique, in my opinion, because it provided some sort of battleground for all sides to learn from. I would argue we've seen the North Korean soldiers being in the Kursk region. I would argue the Chinese and Iranians. I have seen many videos in which you hear the Persian language, they're talking Russian videos that you hear that there are soldiers, amongst soldiers, Iranians, who are talking in Persian. And how much of, we had some sort of collaboration, how much of what has happened in Ukraine would improve the Iranian position, would give them some sort of understanding of the battleground? You've mentioned, let's assume that the United States attacks Iran with fighter jets. Is that enough for an operation? Because the situation going to be totally different, and they're going to get hit. It's not just only the United States attacking Iran. It's going to be the both sides attacking each other.
Well, I
And
mean, the war plan in the United States doesn't call for that. The question is, can the United States seize air superiority over a big chunk of Western Iran's airspace? And I think the answer is yes, we can. Can we sustain that for a limited period of time? And while we're doing that, how many ballistic missiles is Iran going to be able to launch? No mass launches, because you'll all be killed before you launch. You'll get some leakers out there. That's the American plan. Maybe the Iranians have a secret air defense capability that, is we haven't bet on, and we go in there. Next thing you know, we're getting locked on. We lost too many aircraft. We have to pull back and change our tactics. Now the airspace is open and the missiles are flying, and Iran has turned the tables on us. But there's no guaranteed outcome. And again, the American military believes that they will be able to suppress Iran's ballistic missile launch capability. They just won't be able to sustain that suppression. Iran, I think, there are observers there learning and all that, but bringing it back and translating it into, real action. I don't know enough about the Iranian military to know whether or not the observations of Iranian observers come back. Are they brought to the Iranian military command, to the university, and said, turn this into doctrine? Or do they come back and get into discussion groups that lead to, subcommittees talking about this, that, the other thing? How is Iran integrating drone warfare at the tactical level? Are they replicating the Russian model precisely? Or, are they saying, we'll have some guys studying it, but we're not going to do the big transformation? I don't know. I don't know enough about how Iran works to be able to answer that question. I do know that the Russians have slowly but surely turned their military into one of the most responsive professional learning institutions in the world. That as a lesson is developed at the front line, there's now a mechanism for not just the lesson, but the people who learn that lesson to be pulled out, plugged into the education system, and have rapid evaluation and have it turned into doctrine or training package that's then fed down so that as soon as possible after the lesson was learned, it's being taught to people within a context that's applicable to the battlefield. I don't think Iran has that right now. So I don't think the Iranian military is totally transformed into an analog of the Russian military. It's the Iranian military with its own strengths and weaknesses. The Ukrainian military has done a very good job of adaptation. I mean, we only have to look at the most recent NATO exercise in, Estonia, Hedgehog 25, where a couple small units of Ukrainian drone operators basically brought the entire NATO force to a standstill because NATO doesn't know how to fight drone war. But I will say this, that the United States wasn't involved in that. And the United States is a different military than any other military out there. I didn't say better, I said different. And if you think that a bunch of drone operators are going to stop a United States armored division from advancing, then you don't know anything about how the United States operates. Because we will just rain down firepower on the drone. It has to be backed up by a lot more than that. Then it can't just be a bunch of drone units doing hit and run, because we'll just dismount infantry, go in and kill them all with bayonets. we're not Europe. We love to fight. And, so I'm a little hesitant about embracing too wildly the Hedgehog 25 outcome because the United States wasn't involved. It doesn't mean that it would have been different. I would have just liked to see the American response to the Ukrainian hit and run drones, see how well it worked. But there's no doubt that the Russians and Ukrainians are fighting war on a level that nobody else understands and comprehends. The North Koreans were there. They learned a lot. They adapted. We still don't know the full extent of their involvement. Was it some special forces that did some reconnaissance fighting backed up by North Korean artillery, which it seems to be the case, or was there, conventional infantry units that were also, getting dirty and learning tactics, how to advance? Because by the time the North Koreans got involved, it was already a drone war. So you had to adapt to the reality of drone warfare. And, did they work with the Russians? Did they have Russian teams supporting them? Did their own drone teams? How did they, integrate those lessons of the battlefield into doctrine, et cetera? These are all fair questions. You're muted.
Oh, sorry, Scott. The conflict in Ukraine is getting somehow crazy when you look at what is happening in Europe, because they're talking about sending nukes in Ukraine. And let me ask the first question that I asked you when we started this talk. It is the foreign policy of Donald Trump in Ukraine. It's somehow so much confusing. And what is the perception of the Russians, in your opinion, of what Donald Trump is doing?
I think the Russian government has embraced the concept of the spirit of anchorage. And they believe, although Sergei Lavrov recently said that there is no spirit of anchorage, that the United States has not followed through, but I still think the Russian government operates on the hope that they can get the Americans back on to a track that follows along those lines. I'm not privy to the conversations that Steve Witkoff has with Kirill Dmitriev, or the conversations that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have with President Putin, or the conversations they have with President Trump when they come home. No one is privy who has gone public. So I don't know what is being said. What I do know, though, is that major players in the U.S. government are operating as if there is no spirit of anchorage. Mm. Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, whom Donald Trump just, heaps praise after praise after praise, continues to seek to collapse the Russian economy and bring Russia to its knees through economic sanctions. That's not the spirit of Alaska. John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, is trying to assassinate the Russian president. That's not the spirit of Alaska, of Anchorage. The United States is providing targeting intelligence to a British-made drone, the FP5 Flamingo, that's provided to the Ukrainians, that just struck Votkinsk machine building plant, one of the most sensitive and important defense industrial facilities in all of Russia. That triggers the Russian nuclear doctrine, by the way, and that's not much of a spirit of anchorage. So, again, the president might, in his heart of hearts, want peace. But, again, the whole mantra of peace through strength, it's counterproductive, countervailing. It doesn't make any sense. Because the strength that the president's flexing, sanctions, CIA assassination, and critical infrastructure targeting, is so far removed from the notion of the kind of mutual trust that's necessary to negotiate a lasting peace. there's no reason for Russia to trust anything that Donald Trump says nowadays or does. I mean, his track record is not good. What he did to the Iranians in June, what it appears he might be getting ready to do to Iran again, doesn't create the impression of a honest and trustworthy, negotiating partner. So I don't think the Russians are naive. I think the Russians are confused by the mixed signals you get, because again, either Donald Trump is a psychopathic liar. So he's capable of telling Putin one thing and telling his cabinet members another thing, and is secretly giggling at the prospects of an expanded conflict. Or he's just a dilettante who's stuck his foot in waters that he doesn't know how to navigate. And I think it's the latter. I think that if you asked him, he could honestly say, I want peace with Russia, and that he may have directed Witkoff and Kushner to engage in certain conversations. But he's also bought into this peace through strength, model of operation. And so, he has other people out there who don't want peace with Russia. Scott Bessent, John Radcliffe, and others who are looking to bring Russia down. That's the strength aspect of it. And this president...
Why is that, Scott? Where does it come from? What are they gaining from that? Are they literally concerned about the kickbacks, or was something like that? Or what is the ideology under par?
Well, it's a sustainment of ideology that's been in place since 1947, 48. I mean, people need... I know you're running out of time. Just give me a couple minutes, because I'm going to go into a little bit of a history lesson here.